Welcome to Sociology 227, David Harvey Video 1. In this video I've got three goals. First, I want to look at what David Harvey takes from Karl Marx. Next, I want to look at the differences between the capitalism that Karl Marx was looking at and the capitalism that David Harvey is looking at in this week's readings. Finally, I'm going to get you ready to do those readings. Let's do it. David Harvey is a Marxist geographer. In saying that, I mean he's interested in the spaces of capitalism, how they are uneven, and he does so using the terms Marx set out. Hence, David copied Karl. Why neoliberalism? When we refer to neoliberalism, we are talking about a way of organizing social and economic life around market forms. Harvey will say as much on the first page of the article. You might ask, well, how's that any different than liberalism? First, when academics, and almost exclusively left academics, use the term, it is almost always pejorative. We rarely use the term in a positive light, as I'm sure you've expected, since we are talking about Karl Marx. In this sense, the term neoliberalism is used in a way that says liberalism was less radical or less extreme. When we talk about neoliberalism, we're referring to something that started in the late 70s, after the relative stability of Western economic life, post-Second World War. So not only does it refer to a particular way of thinking about economic activity, it also refers to a particular period of economic activity and a particular set of economic and social relations that took place from the 70s on. When I say economic relations, it should remind you of last term. Marx and Durkheim, as you recall, were talking about the changing nature of society in terms of industrial capitalism. When we talk about neoliberalism, as Harvey is doing in this article, he is talking about the economic and social relations that developed after those. Though they took place after, however, the structure of those relations remains somewhat the same. We still have a division of labor, and we still have the commodity form and alienation and so on and so forth, but just to a more advanced form. We have different kinds of commodities, and thus shape our lives around them differently, but the institutional structure of capitalism remains. Remember, commodities, labor, ideology, alienation, all that. Those things still apply. Marx might need to be updated, but the rules of the game are the same. Harvey does more than copy Marx's work. He also modifies it somewhat. Let me tell you some of the ways how he does that. The title of the Harvey piece is Neoliberalism as Creative Destruction. Well, what in the heck is creative destruction if not an oxymoron? That term belongs to the work of famous economist Joseph Schumpeter in his famous book, pictured here, Capitalism, Socialism, Democracy. It is a classic if you continue to take courses in economic sociology or the organization of work or whatever, you're going to encounter it. Schumpeter uses the term creative destruction in reference to the dynamics of capital throughout history. His interest is in how particular innovations in production or technology will abolish the previous status quo until the next series of innovations come around. Here we can think about the use of the steam engine in the Industrial Revolution, of Henry Ford's $5 workday in creating Model Ts, or in Amazon's warehouse system now. In each case, either steam engines, Amazon, or my first car, industrial organization was forever changed by new innovations that shaped the face of capitalism. They destroy the existing mode of production and create a new one. It is this dual process of stagnation and creative destruction that Harvey is interested in throughout the piece. When we talk about creative destruction, we are talking about the internal dynamics of capital to create and destroy particular forms of economic order. Do you guys think I looked really angry in that last transition video? Speaking of the past, David Harvey is interested in history, just like Karl Marx. When you read the piece, you'll find a definition of neoliberalism at the start, a whole bunch of history in the middle, and some concepts at the end. Why? Why can't we just skip to the theory, you might ask? Well, and I'm going to refer you to the work that we did last semester, the history is the whole point. We call Harvey and Marx and Engels historical materialists because they believe that the changing ways that we work and consume are the drivers of historical change. If we just had the theory without the history that made it so, we'd be as bad as the German idealists that Marx was hanging out with in the 19th century. What Harvey is trying to do in his piece is to show us that the materialist conception of history did not end with the global spread of capital. The commodity form, the class relations, the tendency of labor to transform human essence, all of these things have continued after Marx died. Harvey is showing us not only that history proceeded after Karl Marx's death, but also the applicability of Marxist theory to the history of the present. Remember my Marx lecture? Me neither. Let's review some concepts. Alienation, as you recall, was part of Marx's understanding of work under capitalism. When we work, we produce objects that are distinct from ourselves. We also produce ourselves as laborers, changing the way that we relate to labor. This changes how we relate to other people and to the species as a whole. These are the four forms of alienation that Marx talked about in the economic and philosophical manuscripts. Harvey is going to argue that exactly this same form of labor alienation happens under neoliberalism, albeit in a different form than Marx was talking about factory labor. So how we relate to labor is similar, but with new kinds of industries and new kinds of outputs. This is what makes Harvey a Marxist. We are still in a class world, still working under the commodity form, and still laboring under capitalism. Even though capitalism has advanced, labor alienation continues. It isn't of crucial importance that you have the four forms memorized, just that abstract labor value is the basis of capitalism. Then and now. So I've likely let the cat out of the bag on this one, but Harvey's work inherits Marx's emphasis on material conditions. That is, the way that we work, eat, sleep, breathe, as the basis for history. Just as Marx suggested that it was our species being organized into classes and so on that shapes history, Harvey looks at neoliberalism in the same way. The way that we lived, ate, and worked under feudalism was different than the way that we lived, ate, and worked under industrial capitalism. The conditions of life under contemporary capitalism have more in common with the industrial era, Harvey's going to argue, than under the feudal one, because the same class groups that succeeded under industrialization are succeeding now. Recall, capitalism and feudalism are distinct modes of production, ways of organizing work and the products of labor, though they may use the same means of production, as in farms, stores, etc., or they may use different ones. The terms are still applicable in the way that Harvey theorizes neoliberalism. Again, the unit of analysis is material existence, and this is the prime motivator of history. Finally, the concept of ideology. Marx used ideology as a way to dismiss the silly philosophical notions of his contemporaries, asking questions about the nature of man, the process through which we acquire knowledge, how spirit has progressed through history, etc. In each case, the German ideologists failed to see the changing reality around them. They mistook capitalist development for spiritual development. Marx and Engels said, no, guys, in fact, you have to see that all of these developments are taking place because of our changing material conditions, and if you want to follow those, you need to start paying attention to the ways commodities are circulating. Recall the famous lines, "Hitherto, men have always formed wrong ideas about themselves, about what they are, and what they ought to be." These are the first lines from the German ideology. Look at how people work, don't look at how they think about themselves. Harvey, as we will see, is taking a different approach to ideology. He is going to argue that part of neoliberalism is the way that particular class groups try and retain the material conditions given to them by promoting notions of work and policy that keep them rich. So he isn't using it in opposition to the philosophical notion of idealism, but to economic theory and publicity campaigns that justify the status quo. This change in the use of the term ideology is of crucial importance, because it is the second use that will pervade all of the materials that we read for the rest of this course. To repeat, ideology does not only refer to an approach to history shaped by ideas and not materialism, but to the forms of knowledge that justify capitalism as it exists today. Ideology retains a particular social and material order. So both Harvey and Marx are interested in material conditions. But the material conditions in which they are writing are very different. Let's explore them. In these two thinkers, we have two varieties of capitalism. Again, I don't want to overemphasize their differences because they are both capitalist forms. But I suspect that the second column will seem far more relevant to you than the first. When I write the birth of capital there, we are talking about the ways in which the capitalist commodity form started to dominate the world. First, I want to think about the place and industry where capitalism developed in Marx's time. England and textiles. We refer to the birth of capital because England was the first state to start tearing down the old order of feudalism in terms of the new way of producing things and selling them according to the commodity form. The commodity form, as you recall, being the distribution and sale of things according to exchange value rather than simply to use value. Though people had long used money to buy things, the exclusive circulation of goods according to exchange value occurs with the birth of capital. Now, capitalism is in a far different form when Harvey is talking about it. Things still circulate according to exchange value, but the transition has long passed. The type of things that are categorized as exchangeable has also changed, as you will see in the third row of the chart. And I don't think I'm telling any secrets that the prime mover of global capitalism ain't England anymore. There are also significant differences in state forms and geopolitics. When Marx is writing, it is the age of empires. Many of the commodities, if they were in existence, were restricted to the internal economies of empires. As in the case of the Commonwealth, imperial conflicts were rife and determined the form geopolitics would take. We tend to refer to the 1789 to 1918 period as the long 19th century, and to the empires that would dominate throughout the period before starting to collapse after the First World War. Things are, of course, different when we talk about the kind of states that exist today. The age of empires was one of direct control, as in the domination of satellite states by an imperial power. Contemporary neoliberal capitalism tends to, not in every instance, but tends to, refer to capitalist forms in nation-states, and often in democratic ones. Of course, you guys are going to say, what about China? And you're totally right. But, in terms of the dynamics that Harvey is describing in this piece, the object of scrutiny is that of the liberal democratic nation-states with the economic rights that typify liberal democracies. When he outlines the passage to neoliberalism, it is these states, not to large empires or non-democratic states, to which he refers. So think contemporary France, not its Napoleonic predecessor, or China. It has plenty of capitalism, but its historical trajectory is not the one that Harvey outlines in the piece. The last major difference between the two thinkers is economic form. For Marx, the 19th century English economy, and the type of goods distributed within the 19th century English economy, are the basis for theorizing capital. His capital is filled with examples of textiles. Things are, of course, very different in the type of economy that Harvey's talking about. With the transition to the post-industrial economy, we have new kinds of commodities that didn't exist in the early days of industrialization. The financial services industry that makes up so much of the advanced industrial economies had not been developed in the slightest. Now you can buy derivatives, futures, RRSPs, which have their roots in the same commodity form that Marx was talking about. Not only this, but the availability of financial products to the masses is another crucial component of this story. Or consider the case of Amazon or other platforms, which we'll talk about in the next video. Again, I don't want to emphasize change at the expense of continuity. The commodity form dominates, and it is only the particular type of commodity that is shifted. Okay, you've got the background. Go do the readings.